Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 10th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Since the last century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV, YouTube, and archive.org. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been running sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody's saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago. It was her birthday this week, as a matter of fact. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is a light from the east, or light from the least, perhaps, Little Rocket Man edition of News from Neptune. Trump is talking to North Korea, to everyone's surprise, and Obama is talking to Netflix. Along with the Oscars this last weekend, maybe that's what caught Obama's attention, the Italian elections occurred on Sunday, and I have a remark about them for later on. They might tell us, actually, something about how restless Europe is under austerity, neoliberalism, and the U.S. provocations of Russia, like the sanctions which Europe reluctantly observes. So I'll say something about that. We've had very bad reporting on what actually happened in Italy. Two, I want to say something about what looks like almost a second Trump. Mohammed bin Salman, the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, is currently being lionized in the United Kingdom, and the use of British-supplied weapons by the Saudis to maim and kill children in Yemen on an industrial scale has penetrated public consciousness despite the best efforts of mainstream media to sideline it. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, who will soon, if all goes well, be Prime Minister of Great Britain, was absolutely right to highlight the involvement not just of arms manufacturers, but of the British military. Obviously, the situation is even more true on this side of the Atlantic, but it was in Britain that it was discussed this week because of MBS, as he's called, Mohammed bin Salman visit to Britain. The government and royal fawning has been accompanied by an extraordinary deluge of pro-Saudi propaganda from the mainstream media these last couple of days for Saudi Arabia and the supposedly reforming Crown Prince. One of his reforms, of course, is an effective alliance with Israel and the threatening of war, notably against Iran in the Middle East. Qatar has become closer economically to Iran and has developed new port facilities, which reduce import reliance on Saudi Arabia and its dependencies. The Saudis had massed troops on the border and threatened invasion of Qatar, but the Qataris vowed to fight. Then something remarkable happened, which the world mainstream media has almost entirely ignored. Despite Saudi-sponsored advertisements all over U.S. media portraying named senior Qataris as terrorist sponsors, and despite strong Israeli pro-Saudi lobbying, Donald Trump suddenly called bin Salman to heel. With Saudi troops massed on the Qatari border, on 30th of January, the United States signed an agreement with Qatar, quote, to deter and confront any threat to Qatar's territorial integrity, close quote. This was a massive slap in the face to bin Salman from Donald Trump, and a result of Tillerson recognizing the real threat to the world from bin Salman's extreme ambition. Of course, it was one in the eye for the Israelis, too, and a reversal in some ways of the saber-rattling against Iran that's been coming from this administration. Both these matters, the Korean reversal and the Saudi reversal, by the Trump administration caught the political establishment quite by surprise this week. And I'd love to hear David's reaction to this and whatever else he has on his agenda for today.
Yeah, I think I've been surprised by somewhat different things because I haven't been following those issues as closely as you have. In fact, this is the first I've heard about the Qatari business. What you said reminded me, though, that the Real News Network has been interviewing the so-called angry Arab a couple of times about the relationship between Israel and the Saudi royal family, and does a very good job of that. His name is Asad Abu Khalil, and he writes the Angry Arab blog, and you could link to those programs or to read the transcripts from his blog. Let me mention, and I'm just going to run down a kind of list of things.
Sure.
I don't want to go that deeply into anything until we decide what our priorities are here. The two strikes of note that have ended, one locally with the GEO, and the other in West Virginia with the teachers, and it's worth talking about what the victories and perhaps defeats might be involved in these, whether victories are a good thing and people getting something is a good thing, but in the context of the way labor has gone in this country, I think it's worth drawing back a little bit and saying what was not gotten or not gained in these strikes, although I definitely count them both as positive things.
Absolutely.
The thing that is more just as obvious in terms of what Trump is doing, of course, has to do with his tariff leveling, his trade. Not so much even what he did, because it isn't clear that it's that important,
right,
but what the reaction was among elites in this country, especially what was made in the liberal press of the resignation of Gary Cohn, the Wall Street Goldman Sachs primary economic advisor in the White House, who had gotten enough, apparently, who knows what goes on behind the scenes. I doubt that very often it's the one reason why somebody leaves. He probably wanted to leave and just needed some reason. I don't know that, but that's just the way these things seem to go. But the way the media responded to this, there's some interesting things to talk about, and they were debated on Democracy Now! Between Michael Hudson and Lori Wallach, who had very different points of view. And Michael Hudson also has an article up on Counterpunch this morning. But we can talk about what the meaning of all that is. But I think, as one of the interviewees on the Real News, a guy named Heiner Flassbeck, a very good German political economist that they rely on, what he pointed out was this really, the fundamental aspect of trade and of neoliberal trade, in terms of really seriously addressing it, has not to do with tariffs and so forth. It has to do with currency and the value of currency and the manner in which the US dollar is compared to other currencies around the world, especially the European Union, but of course also China. A big week that we celebrate every year, APAC.
And it must be spring.
It must be spring. It must be
APAC has been cited.
Almost spring. Chuck Schumer. Just kowtows, of course. But kind of interesting local angle on this. Kamala Harris, the senator from California, and the sort of female Obama, touted as a candidate, not officially yet, but as a candidate for president for 2020, did a off-the-record interview at APAC, in which she said basically all the same things Chuck Schumer get. It may be a slightly more feminine tone, but she was kind of outed from this. Apparently, a local student who was back there, a guy associated with the Illini PAC, pro-Israel, local pro-Israel APAC, was one of the one of the people that exposed this, if needed to be exposed, off the record interview that Kamala Harris did. Of course, being positive about saying, "Hey, go Kamala Harris. You're on board with the Israel lobby and with Zionism and the whole thing." What's interesting and what it's important to understand, as I've been observing the local Jewish Zionist community for the past 20 years, is there really isn't one anymore in any official sense. Illini Pack used to be on the Hillel website. It no longer is. They no longer refer to it. There's no longer anything on the Jewish Federation website, except maybe a reference to the Birthright program, but nothing connecting to Israel, to the broader Jewish community's support. There's been a real separation of official political support for Israel in the last 10 years or so, especially perhaps the last 5 years, that compared, which makes it a very different environment than it was 20 years ago when I moved here and started railing against people.
And why has that happened?
It's happened because I don't have any insider knowledge of how these things work, but I just think that the leadership, there's been a certain turnover in leadership, and I think that there's been a somewhat of a change in the manner in which more ordinary Jewish people view Israel, especially during the Obama years, in which obviously Netanyahu opposed Obama's Iran policies and made quite a spectacle. So liberal Jews just aren't quite, as Norman Finkelstein is constantly pointing out, liberal Jews just aren't quite as on board with what's going on there. They haven't opposed it, but they're just kind of distancing themselves from it.
I think that's an important thing, and I think it's a trend that's perhaps much broader than is being reported. I posted an article from Haaretz last week by a young American Jew who was appalled at the support for the occupation that he finds in Israel and among American Jews, and noted that it was declining. That his generation is appalled by it, and the result has been a lessening of support for it.
Yeah, and Phil Weiss at Mondo Weiss keeps on top of these things and always reports the latest poll results about what younger Jews are thinking about Israel. So
the scandal in Gaza that you were talking about from Finkelstein's new book certainly contributes to this.
Absolutely, and the local business with Steven Saleda probably turned off a lot of students. I mean, there's always with students, there's always this sort of turnover, and you sort of have to keep up with what's going on. And I'm a little out of touch with all that, but also along with the AIPAC thing, I would note that there was a kind of a small counter AIPAC sort of day-long conference sponsored by the Washington, sort of the think tank for the anti-Zionist lobby in Washington, which publishes a journal called the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, and their featured speaker was Gideon Levy, the excellent columnist from Haaretz, which you just mentioned, along with Amira Haas, are usually the two genuinely dissident Israelis that come out to these kinds of things, or at least genuinely dissident Israeli journalists. And there's a couple more that probably deserve to be thrown into that category, but they're the two most prominent ones. But again, and then Aaron Mate did a couple of interviews with Levy on the Real News Network, and again, the whole presentation that he has, which is very good and very articulate, also gets into the issues of one state and two states. And Levy himself has given up on two states, and the people that I tend to support, Chomsky, Finkelstein, et cetera, haven't given up on two states. No. Therefore, I haven't given up on two states. Right. But I guess the one statement I would make in regard to that, I think it's a fair debate, worthwhile. But it's when we talk about what's possible in politics, it's like it's a judgment call as to what's possible. So people are saying, well, because of the settlement project, two states are no longer possible. There's too many Jews in too many Jewish settlements, too many Jews in the West Bank to kind of reverse this process. So you have to go straight to one state. And the question is, how are you going to get there? And what Chomsky and Finkelstein are arguing is that you're not going to get there. And then what other people are arguing is that, well, you don't have to take all those settlers out. You have to just take some of them out and redraw the borders in certain ways and blah, blah, blah.
But land trades have been part of the understanding of of the two-state solution from the beginning, almost, right?
Right.
And it just as the settlements spread, it just makes it more so.
Yeah, and so again, when we talk about what's possible, it's definitely a judgment call as to how far we go in saying this is no longer possible. But there's always the aspect of things that are possible if you believe that they're possible. I mean, it's not purely a matter of faith. There's got to be some reality involved there. But in this case, I think there's enough reality involved, especially when it comes, of course, to the manner in which the U.S. government, the U.S. foreign policy, treats this particular issue.
That's not being possible would become a self-fulfilling prophecy in this case, and it's not clear that the prophets are speaking truth here.
Yeah. So, and just to conclude a few media recommendations for this week. After last week's interview with Doug Henwood, that Doug Henwood did with the woman who, Marcy Smith is her name, who did working on the piece about Gene Sharp, which surprised me how good it was. And I wasn't even going to hear it, and then when I did, I said, wow, this is really something. He did the same thing again this week with his wife, Eliza Featherstone, who is doing some work on focus groups. And I don't know, why don't I listened to a whole hour about focus groups? But again, this is a fascinating interview that goes into the whole history of how focus groups evolved in this country, which has a kind of socialist history in a certain way. Really, really fascinating. So I want to put that out there. I also want to put out the interviews that Paul Jay is doing with Leo Panitch on the Real News Network about his background. And I'm sure you'll get into Korea and Trump. And the last thing, apropos to some of the things we refer to on this program, Louis Proyect, the unrepentant Marxist, has finally taken my advice after arguing with him on his blog, and I've said to him more than once, what if you're so set on supporting the rebels in Syria and so set on demonizing the people who have who he claims are supporting Assad in Syria, like Max Blumenthal and Rania Khalek and Ben Norden, I told him, why don't you write on Counterpunch about that instead of writing about movies? And this morning, that's exactly what he does. He has a long article, just let it all out, and let people respond in this forum, as opposed to on his blog, about what he's charging these people with, and around the whole issue of what Assad is doing in East Ghouta and what has happened there with the massacres and so forth. So I think we can expect some more open debate about this issue as it relates to the so-called what Proyect demeaningly calls the anti-imperialist left, or perhaps the Assadist left, and between those people who feel like they are proud to oppose American policy in the region and claim not to be supporters of Assad, and who claim that Proyect is vastly underestimating the role of the Saudis and others in arming the so-called rebels. And in his article on Counterpunch this morning, Proyect doesn't mention the Saudis even once.
What a surprise.
Okay.
Thank you, David. That catches us up. We should mention that our friend Jeffrey Sinclair, who edits Counterpunch, has, full disclosure here, has published both of us on various occasions, and is a man Catholic in his tastes, as I usually describe it, simply because it annoys him because people hear a capital C, and I mean it with a lowercase c, that is universal in his taste. He understands that it's worthwhile to publish things that he doesn't entirely agree with in order to keep the discussion going. And Counterpunch is remarkably successful in that regard. He has far more material than he can publish on the Counterpunch website or in the magazine, the hard copy magazine they put out. We recommend both, not because there's a party line that's being defended by Jeffrey, although Jeffrey writes enough of his own stuff that you know indeed where he does stand. But he also is, as I say, lowercase c Catholic in his taste, and publishes a lot of people he doesn't agree with. And I won't mention Louis Proex's name directly, but it might come in at this point.
The clever thing that Louis did in his article this morning is he referred and strongly implied that both Louis and his co-editor Josh Frank are supporters
both Jeffrey.
Are supporters of Louis' point of view in this regard. So he's kind of marshaled them. I don't know if they like being marshaled that way, and I think maybe we'll find out about that also. But
I think we will too.
As I say, let's be open. Let's talk to each other about this. And Louis makes that hard because he doesn't so much like talking to them as name calling at them. And I've encouraged him.
He's so strange in that regard.
When I'm not name calling back at him, I'm encouraging him not to name call so much. So I go back and forth on the whole name calling issue because sometimes I just feel like name calling too. But I think I'm a little better at that than he is. But then again, I don't have my own blog, and I'm not an unrepentant Marxist anyway.
If you are interested in the sorts of things that we talk about here, we would both agree that one of the best places to go for the continuation of that discussion or the amplification of that discussion is the website Counterpunch and the hard copy magazine Counterpunch, put out by our friend Jeffrey Sinclair.
I often expect there to be counter arguments, not just comment sections, but counter arguments. And I'm often disappointed in that, in people's willingness to sometimes engage these arguments. Louis has also been critical of a fellow that I like, Daniel Lazar, who commented on his website, but didn't write an article. Didn't bother to write an article really, or he was, he had an article. Louis was responding to that, and Daniel didn't respond back in any kind of long coherent form. But
I think you and I may disagree on Lazar, but that's probably an argument for another day.
Okay.
We point out you're watching news from Neptune, and we're talking about the editor of the Counterpunch website, and he had a good comment, I thought, a couple of days ago. I quote Jeffrey Sinclair, "The seismic activity recorded after the South Korean announcement that Trump would meet with Kim Jong-un in May was John Bolton detonating." Well, I think that may be right. John Bolton, who keeps being mentioned, this mad neocon who keeps being mentioned for positions within the Trump administration, obviously would go ballistic, no pun intended, about the announcement by Trump that he is going to discuss these matters with the leader of North Korea. It was interesting, I thought, that the Secretary of State, who is traveling, who is abroad, Rex Tillerson, made a point to say that Trump decided to talk to Kim Jong-un on his own. Quote, I'm quoting Tillerson here, the Secretary of State, "This is a decision the President took himself. I spoke to him very early this morning about that decision, and we had a very good conversation," close quote. So a lot of the things we've been hearing recently about who's making decisions in the Trump administration may need to be reworked, and what those decisions actually are certainly are ruffling the feathers in the political establishment's dovecoat at the moment, and we should pay attention to that because this is indeed very important, both in terms of American politics and the question of whether we're going to blow up the world or not. Very interesting.
That's a big question.
Yes, and that's an important question.
Important question.
Exactly. A parallel and connected in some ways issue is raised by the departure of Gary Cohn, the economic advisor, leading economic advisor of Donald Trump. What's happened here is that the two major thrusts of the Trump campaign, represented by Gary Cohn and Steve Bannon, have now both been excised, apparently, from the Trump administration and Trump's out there on his own. This is worrying them in Washington very much indeed. We have to remember the background of this is that the American political establishment was desperately afraid that Donald Trump would do some of the things he talked about in the campaign that made him president, like talking with Vladimir Putin. It's a conspiracy, says the political establishment, and Putin's got something on Trump. No, Trump had said that he wants to make a deal. Trump said he wanted to make a deal with the Chinese. No, said the political establishment. The hostility against China, established in the South China Sea by Hillary Clinton most recently, the hostility to Russia, established by the Obama administration's coup in Ukraine, a shameful episode that was never well reported in this country, these must continue. We must maintain this hostility to these peer competitors, Russia and China, and Trump looks like departing from that. Trump looks like he wants to do a deal. We can't have that. That's been the burden of the first year of the Trump administration, and for the moment, it looks as though the Trump of the campaign is resurging, and the war provocations, the war scares that are the stock and trade of the American political establishment may be lessening. As John Pilger pointed out before the administration, this would be black comedy if the stakes weren't so high. But the stakes are high, and interesting things are happening. One word about Gary Cohn that I'd like your take on,
sure.
David. The Cohn, the economic advisor who left the Trump administration this week, presumably over the arguments about tariffs on steel and aluminum. Cohn is being discussed in the American press, and I mean the political establishment press, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the sycophantic news stations, television news stations, etc. They have been, the line they've been taking is almost impossible to believe. All of these outlets, notably the Washington Post and the various news sluices like Vox, for example, are making much of the fact that Trump called Gary Cohn a globalist. A globalist. Trump on Cohn's departure, Trump says, well, he's a globalist, but I like him, and I'm sorry he's going, so forth and so on. Now, the Washington Post picked this up, and so did these other publications as well, and said, we've got to understand what's going on here. Globalist is an anti-Semitic smear.
Oh, that I did not hear.
You haven't heard this? This is just incredible. What's happening here is that the identity politics that activated the Clinton campaign, and that's a stock and trade of the mainstream media, had to come up with some explanation for the departure of Cohn that didn't have to do with the long-term political, political project of the Trump administration. Look, Cohn is a globalist in the sense that he speaks for neoliberal economics. That's his job. He is a globalist in the sense that was discussed during the campaign and that Trump attacked. But we can't talk about the fact that that fact in the American media. We have to find another interpretation of it, and the other interpretation of it is this identity politics interpretation that globalist means Jew, that globalist means part of the international Jewish economic conspiracy or something, and that's what Trump was hinting at. Look, what's going on here is very different. Globalism, in the sense of neoliberalism, has been the project, has been the policy of American capitalism, of the American ruling class, for more than a generation. What that means is a financialization of the economy, a destruction of the limitations on the exercise of capitalist exploitation at home and abroad, the offshoring of American jobs to less expensive places in the rest of the world. This is the sort of thing that globalism has meant, and this is the sort of thing that Trump attacked in the campaign, and that now, a year later, seems like it's playing out with the departure of Cohn. I don't know. I think we can overstate that. I think there may be less to that than meets the eye. But the fact of the matter is, this can only be reported by the American political establishment in terms of identity politics. Doesn't have to do with the policy of globalism, which indeed are wretched and should be excised. Yeah. It has to do with the fact that, well, maybe he's a Jew. I found that just unbelievable, David.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not unbelievable in the sense it's perfectly consistent with what American policy
the anti-Semitism card.
Been doing. Yeah. I mean, it's astonishing.
But
instead of telling people what's really going on in this administration, we get this identity politics nonsense.
Yeah, but the whole way it's framed in the New York Times, as well as presumably the Washington Post, which I don't really read, is that Trump gets into office and he needs to be handled by the so-called adults in the room.
Exactly.
And Cohn was one of those adults.
Exactly.
Meaning the adults that are incorporated into the foreign policy establishment, into the neoliberal establishment, Wall Street, banks, and so forth. So it becomes very clear that somebody like, I don't know if Paul Krugman mixed up in any of these accusations, or
I haven't seen Krugman on Cohn's departure yet.
Yeah, well, he's just writing about trade this and trade. I mean, Paul Krugman is just reaffirming his somewhat radical views towards globalization and trade. And I mean, Paul Krugman at one time, I mean, in the context of what Obama was trying to do, could seem as a reasonable liberal, or what's the word he uses, liberal common sense, or the conscience of a liberal in perhaps the older sense of the word, like the government should help people. But Paul Krugman made his name and won his Nobel Prize on the basis of his theories about so-called free trade, of which there is no such thing, of course, and that and so in the context of Cohn's leaving, Gary Cohn, C-O-H-N, his leaving, Krugman is reaffirming this idea that he was the adult in the room, having responsible attitudes about globalization and trade and so forth. And the whole anti-Semitism thing, that's just kind of icing on the cake as far as I'm concerned. I mean, there's real issues at stake here. It isn't that Trump really has a coherent plan for countering 40 years of neoliberal policies, but
he criticized it.
Yeah,
that's
but
the point.
He criticized it, and then he put these tariffs up, and it's probably much more is being made out of it, but still it means something, and it scares these people.
But the point is that the political establishment, including Krugman, has seized on this description, Trump's description of Cohn as a globalist, which has a reasonable interpretation. That's quite true. He is a globalist if you understand globalism as neoliberal economics. They've seized on that, but can't deal with the real issues at stake there, therefore have to turn it into an identity politics line and say, oh, here's Trump being an anti-Semite. This is the maddest thing I've heard since the Russiagate thing arose. It's not an accident. It's not that they've misinterpreted what's going on here. It just means we can't really have a discussion on those economic issues that help to make Trump president because of his criticism of them. That's too dangerous because too many people will agree with Trump once again. Therefore, we have to minimize what Trump is saying by saying, oh, that's just another example of his racism or what have you. This is outrageous.
And at a more reasonable level, like I said before, the debate between Michael Hudson and Lori Wallach of the Global Trade Watch was informative as to what the real issues might be, and they don't agree with each other. Lori Wallach, who's worked with Ralph Nader for many years and is now, I think, more on her own in that regard, she argues that it will bring jobs back and that it's a good thing. It's just very clear. And Michael Hudson has a different perspective from a global perspective on how trade works. And so, you could learn something from reading what they're saying and writing. You can't learn anything from reading the New York Times. And even when they do put someone up, when they put some congressperson up to write a sort of something in favor of what Trump did, he writes it in terms of national security, meaning military security, meaning we need to make our own steel in case we go to war. We shouldn't be dependent on other countries. Imagine what if we'd been dependent on Canada for steel, during World War II or something like that. So the argument, even when they put someone opposed to or someone supporting Trump, they sort of get off track. They present this as this kind of populist argument, this kind of sort of bad populist argument, or just this pro-military argument, as opposed to a pro-working class argument.
And this is the discussion we should be having, the very real discussion that we should be having about American policy, and that discussion is too dangerous to the political establishment. Therefore, it has to be turned aside somehow. Can't be countered, but it has to be misinterpreted and turned aside, convince people that something else is going on here, in this case, Trump's racism. That is, it's incredible. It really is quite remarkable.
Isn't this pretty much analogous to what Trump is? He's just stirring things up with the Korea business. I mean, the coverage of that and the way it's framed is somewhat analogous to the way anything that Trump does that somebody might like is framed.
Well,
just that
that's right.
Either he did it he doesn't. It's a good thing, but he doesn't really know what he's doing, which is true. But that doesn't make it not a good thing.
So instead, let's ignore these opinion leaders in the Washington Post and New York Times and have a real discussion about the American economy, a real discussion about bringing jobs back to America, or perhaps doing something else to deal with the fact that the jobs aren't coming back, like universal basic income or something like that. These are the sorts of things we should be doing. A lot of people, by the way, advised the Trump administration that it was going to have to move in those directions at its beginning, and even people like what's his name, Boris Kargalitsky, who wrote a Russian commentator who writes about Western affairs as well, who wrote one of the most intelligent pieces of advice to the incoming Trump administration that I saw, where he simply explained why it was that Trump had got elected. Trump had got elected because Americans had been immiserated by the accelerating growth of inequality in the last generation, and Americans are objecting to the sort of backdoor wars that the Obama administration involved the country in, and that Trump, if ordered to be reelected, is going to have to spend his first term accentuating those 2 points, i.e. dealing with the economic issues that people actually have, like health care, for example, and dealing with the foreign policy situation, like ending the foreign wars. Now, it's a particularly intelligent piece and still worth reading after a better part of a year, but there certainly weren't many indications that the Trump administration was taking that sort of advice seriously. Until now, until we get this rejection of globalism, which isn't anti-Semitism, and the conversation with Koreans, which is not a result of Trump being Putin's puppet. Suddenly we have it, and the American political establishment is not sleeping well for fear that the Trump they were scared of in the campaign is coming back to haunt them. Would that it were so.
But, and this is going to be pretty as critical of counterpunch as I probably will get, their regular writers are not doing anything to help the process of understanding what Trump might be doing that might be any good.
What should be doing.
Should be doing.
Yeah. They're
just too busy making fun of him, and Paul Street is too busy making up clever names to talk about Trump. And even Jeffrey St. Clair really can't control himself when it comes to talking about Trump. So I don't see the only we'll see whether this pattern follows through in relation to the whole Syria thing, because the people that Louis Proyect has been so critical of, like Max Blumenthal, don't usually publish on Counterpunch. What Counterpunch does have is Patrick Coburn, who reports from the region and reports from a perspective that is not pro-Assad, but that is clearly critical of the way the quote-unquote rebels, have conducted themselves in Iraq and Syria, and critical of U.S. foreign policy. But basically, it's just reporting, which kind of, in a sense, speaks for itself.
Exactly. You're watching News from Neptune, and I will remind you once again of the quotation we began with, that we often begin with here, from Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said, and quite rightly I think, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. And the corollary to that is that the people who want to avoid such revolutionary things have to obfuscate what is happening, and they have powerful instruments to do that. Instruments with names like the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, mainstream media in general. So the job is to cut through the fog. The fog is not an accident. The fog is deliberate. The fog is there to mislead. The only enemy that the American political establishment is really afraid of, and that, of course, is the American populace. That's what has to be controlled, and the fog is there to do it. So, do we have any fog cutters coming up?
This
David?
just sort of made. I'm not sure if this fits in or not, but I don't usually read the Intercept website per se. I usually come across some articles that people pass around. It seems like some of the journalists, Jeremy Scahill, Glenn Greenwald, and who's the other one? There was three of them.
James Risen?
Yeah, James Risen. Yeah, that's it. So they came in for a lot of criticism about a talk that they did, or just, I don't know if it was sort of a conversation, or about Russiagate, about and apparently Risen has come out with this critique. Risen, who did a lot of good work in relation to what? Would you remind me?
Secrecy and the intelligence.
Iraq War.
Right.
Iraq War. But now, so I guess the question is, as we turn away from the media, that's obviously corrupt, with Washington Post being owned by Amazon.com and so forth, and Jeff Bezos, but the Intercept, which is owned by which was started by a really rich guy, Pierre Omidyar, apparently has its constraints or has its issues, and people that have become sort of icons on, and rightfully icons on the left, like Greenwald and Scahill, are being accused of being compromised.
Yeah, and there's some. Given the background and interests of the owner of the Intercept, these suspicions are not out of place. They're worth keeping an eye on. But that said, I do want to say that the particular discussion that we're speaking of now between Glenn Greenwald and James Risen is still worth reading, and The Intercept, what publishes some questionable things, is still publishing some worthwhile things that are not seeing the light of day elsewhere. So the jury is out, and the jury is you, so you should read about these things and also read about the very real criticisms of the sort that David just offered that are quite appropriate. Now, to the Scahill Greenwald Risen discussion itself, I should say that Jeremy Scahill is almost a moderator more than anything else, has more to do with sort of keeping the discussion going than taking a position himself. Greenwald is extremely good. The discussion is worth reading. It begins with an article that the equivocal James Risen published last week under the title, Is the President a Traitor? Is Trump guilty of treason?
Yeah.
Now, look, the most extreme sort of Russiagate nonsense that we could find here. And Risen, who was harassed by the American government for his revelation of secrets and so forth, now suddenly is saying, well, we have this evidence here and there are possibilities we don't know, we'll have to look and so. And Greenwald takes him apart on it in the actual discussion, saying, you know, this is a smokescreen. This is not not the point. First of all, to call Trump a traitor because he wants to establish an understanding with the Russians and the Chinese is at the very heart of the political establishment's opposition to Trump and reason for its fear of Trump. And Risen is doing their work for them in this. And it's a very silly column. I actually read the Risen column before I read the discussion between the two of them. Risen's original column is just a shameful collection of Russiagate smears that has sort of the feeling of trying to get Jim Risen back into the game, you know. This is what people are talking about, then I'll talk about it too. But Greenwald calls him on this and says, you know, this is, you know, you're eating smoke. You're taking the smoke screen of the establishment and not talking about the serious issues which are involved in U.S.-Russian relations or U.S.-Chinese relations, and this is not only a mistake; it's very dangerous. And I think Greenwald has by far the better of the argument. I'll put a link to this discussion on our Facebook page, but I recommend you read it.
You know, when you work for the New York Times, and then does Risen not work for them anymore?
I think he doesn't. I think he's a freelancer
right,
now too.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting historically to look at the people who get out of the New York Times and how they do it and to what extent they do it.
Daniel Ellsberg. And
well, you know, you've got Chris Hedges, who when he got out, he really got out.
Right.
But then you have someone like Stephen Kinzer, who got out in some ways, but didn't get out in other ways. I mean, he's still, he's critical of U.S. foreign policy, but not consistently, as far as I understand him. Another person, who else am I trying to think of who left the New York Times? Well, anyway, I didn't. The New York Times hires good journalists. They hire good people who can do good investigative reporting, and often come up with good stories. But when push comes to shove, the question is whether they're going to oppose the establishment line. And if you're going to do it, you might as well go whole hog like Chris Hedges did and really condemn your former employer. And I doubt if Risen, I don't know if Risen goes that far, but.
Well, and the important thing, once again, is to tell the truth and shame the devil. Yeah. And there's some very, very serious questions about whether James Risen, for all his troubles with the American government, was actually involved with it. And I have a little note here on something that we've been talking about, the website Counterpunch and their magazine tonight, that Counterpunch was involved in regarding Risen many years ago. Yeah. This is the background of this man who is talking now about Russiagate. Mm-hmm. In an article that Risen co-wrote with another reporter called Jeff Girth for the New York Times that appeared in March 1999, they alleged, and I'm quoting here, a Los Alamos computer scientist who is Chinese American had stolen nuclear secrets for China, close quote. I mean, that's Chinagate before Russiagate, eh? Right. Chinagate, that was 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, and Risen was the lead reporter on this story. The suspect, and by the way, if I first read about this in Counterpunch in 1999 or shortly afterwards, so they have a history. The suspect, later identified as Wenho Lee, pleaded guilty to a single charge of improper handling of national defense information. The 58 other counts against him were dropped, and he was released from jail. No espionage charges were ever proved. the judge apologized to Lee for believing the government and the U.S. government and putting him in pretrial solitary confinement for months. So that's what the U.S. government was doing, and James Risen was applauding it. In 2000, the New York Times apologized for significant errors in reporting the case. Yes, significant errors. They locked you away as a solitary confinement for it, but we're sorry about that because we made mistakes. Lee and a co-author would later write a book, My Country versus Me, in which he described Risen's work as, quote, a hatchet job on me and a sloppy one at that, close quote. And he points out numerous factual errors in Risen's reporting. The New York Times was one of the newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times, which jointly agreed to pay damages to settle a lawsuit concerning their coverage of the case and invasion of privacy. Close quote. 1999, 2000. Almost 20 years later, James Risen is doing the same, something similar, it looks like. In this case, the target is not a questionable Chinese-American nuclear scientist, but the current president of the United States.
Yeah. And Jeff Girth, the guy that was co-author, he goes all the way back to the Whitewater scandal in perhaps a more complicated way.
I forgot that.
He was sort of anti-Clinton in that context.
No harm in that.
He was no, not at all. But the Clinton defenders at that time, I assume that whatever the Clintons were doing in regard to Whitewater, or was it Hillary Clinton and their land deal and the whole thing, I assume it was much worse than it probably was presented in the New York Times, except Girth, put himself in a place of being, as a New York Times journalist, of being extremely criticized and even vilified for going after the Clintons, the liberal heroes of the 1990s, in that way. So, it gets complicated in terms of, what journalists do, what story they're really willing to stick to, what price they're willing to pay, and where their head's at in dealing with the way power works in this country.
You are watching.
Still watching.
Aware on the air, if you're still watching. And we have a few minutes left. But one thing I'd like to turn to here, based on the reporting of our friend Bob Naiman of Just Foreign Policy, who writes that the last report, the vote on the Senate on the Sanders-Lee bill, that's Bernie Sanders, if you remember him, the Sanders-Lee bill to end the Saudi war in Yemen, that's a little overstated, but they end certainly the American support, which is crucial for the Saudi war in Yemen. That vote in the Senate could be Monday. So you can think of calling your senator or writing emailing your senators or calling other senators on this point. This is very important. This shameful war in Yemen that the U.S. is supporting. The Saudis have killed people at a great rate, spread a cholera epidemic, starved the people of Yemen for reasons having to do only with their local control. Several senators have turned tail on this thing, on this Sanders resolution that would at least limit American support for our principal ally in the region and what they're doing, that is Saudi. Indiana Republican Senator Todd Young, who was formerly opposed to American support for the Saudis, may be defecting to the other side, pushing an alternate bill that's making its way through the Senate that would continue support for American opposition to terrorism. GOP Senator, Todd Young and Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire have written this alternate bill that says, well, they really shouldn't be doing these things in Yemen, and we shouldn't be paying for it, and we shouldn't be helping, but we still have to continue to fight Al-Qaeda, and so long as they're doing that, we should support them. This is doubly shameful because, of course, it's a lie. There are other groups that have stepped forward to support the Sanders bill, and the vote in the Senate will be close. So particularly if you have connections to the Indiana senatorial delegation or New Hampshire, write your senators and write our own senators and support it. There is one other. Oh, you have
No,
another
it's
issue.
okay. No, it's
One
okay.
other issue that I wanted to mention before we go. Noam Chomsky, our mentor, and the actor Danny Glover are among a group of over 154 activists who've condemned the sanctions imposed on Venezuela by the U.S. In an open letter to Washington and Ottawa, the Canadian government, the activists argued sanctions affected the poor and negatively impacted any chance of political reconciliation. That's from Telesur, and is a fairly mild description of what the letter actually says. The U.S. is doing what it can to overthrow the government of Venezuela 5 years after the death of Chavez, and this is another shameful operation by your government that passes under the radar for most Americans, I'm afraid. And it's worthwhile that people like Chomsky and Glover and other public figures say something about this, and it should be spread abroad.
And certainly, even given all the shameful things the New York Times does these days in relation to Russiagate and everything else, their extremely polemical coverage of the Venezuela situation is just scrapes the bottom of the barrel when it comes to propaganda on the front page of the New York Times, and it's clearly a concerted effort to either not, quote unquote, non-violently or violently overthrow the government, the elected government, and to sort of muddy the process by which the Venezuelans themselves decide who is to govern them. It's just beyond shameful.
And once again, the failure of the American media to talk about what actually is going on here and simply report strikes and observations, animosities in Venezuela without putting it in any context at all is not an accident. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 10th week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scollery. This has been a Light from the East, or Light from the Least, Little Rocket Man edition. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. Those notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.